Well, we got ToXiC in the surgery. Needs a couple of little things and a couple of little things that he doesn't necessarily need. Now, I don't know that all of those are going to happen at the same time. But first, he's got a bit of an upper respiratory issue. So I'll show you that in a little while. And then we've got a little bit of facial treatment to do. So that lower grill bar, remove the fog lights, maybe not straight away. And then we also have a steering box conversion to do. Probably not also straight away, but the point being, you got to see some things happening to ToXiC. Haven't shown you much of him, but yeah, you got to see a few things happening. And the first one is a bit of maintenance, upper respiratory issue. Let's have a quick look at what I'm talking about. So I actually thought that we had a leaking exhaust manifold down here because it sounds terrible. But as it turns out, a friend of mine who knows a fair bit about Chevs, I can't claim to be an expert, reckons that where that soot is on the middle, just in there, that there is a crossover pipe. That is actually a crossover pipe from the exhaust on a standard manifold would go across there. And he feels that the gasket, the intake gasket, has blown out there. Now, I'll get it running and I'll try and show you why he believes that. He knows from experience, but also he basically showed me how to check that. So what I'm going to need to do is pull the intake manifold off and everything that goes with that. Focus, and everything that goes with that. And then check that the manifold is correctly mated to the heads, just in case there's been some machining done to change the deck height, or the manifold may have been changed. And then, yeah, we're going to put a new gasket there. I've got to find out the port size so I can get the appropriate gasket. So we've got to be doing that. Also, I know that my clutch fan, the clutch in my fan is no good. So I've ordered a new one of those. So we'll be doing that as well. And as I said, we will be doing a steering box. But there's a little bit more involved in that, obviously. And I'll bite off one thing at a time, but down here that thing's going to be replaced with a new steering box, and apparently it's going to make a dramatic difference to my steering, which will be great, because if there's one thing that lets this old beast down, it's the steering. So yeah, so I'll start it up and I'll show you what I mean there. I don't know how much this is going to come through in the video, but it sounds like a leaking exhaust manifold. But what it actually is that area that I was pointing at. Now, it's a bit hard for me to show you, but this area just here, that area right there, where that soot is, if I put my hand over that, I can actually feel exhaust coming out of it. So the gasket is blown there. So that's the area we're going to be working on. First things first, let's start pulling this baby apart. Okay, winner winner, chicken dinner. So I undid that bolt, which is not surprising, that was stopping it from coming up. But even then, I was trying to pry it up carefully with the screwdriver, couldn't get it up. So I just got a sharp Stanley knife and ran it along the bead of silicon across the front, and then it didn't pop, but could hear it coming up. And I can see that coolant has fallen out of the coolant galleries, water cooling galleries, into the oil inside, so I'll show you that as well. So we've got to be careful to mop that up. Now just on the silicon, the RTV, what I'll show you with that, pretty much I'm absolutely no expert on Chev engines, but everything I've ever seen, if you're putting an intake manifold on those, use the gasket on either side, the correct one. They're not all the same, different port sizes in the head. So I've got to measure that up before I order my gaskets. And then there is the exhaust crossover that I need to blanket off because this manifold doesn't use it, and that could be why it's blown out, or it could be the torque of those bolts was not enough, which that was definitely the case. But pretty much everyone says don't use the rubber gaskets that go on the end. Just throw them away and put some RTV. And when I'm putting it together, I'll make a point of showing you how I do that, because it's worked for me twice in the past. Again, no expert, but it's worked for me twice, and that's on everyone else's advice. So that's what we're going to do. So if you've never done it before, then you'll see it here. So now I've got to lift this off, and what I've got to do is not get my good clothes dirty, because I actually went out today and I just decided that I'd work on the car without changing my clothes. Let's see what we can see with this gasket. So firstly, a little bit of coolant down in the oil there, so I'll soak that up. And you may have seen I was trying to get rid of all of that along the way as well. Now this gasket's fallen in. Where's that from? I'll have to check where that piece is from. But right there, top of that there, that's where it was blown out. That port there, and the one on the other side, that one in the middle, they're exhaust ports. They don't get used apparently. So on my manifold, that should be blanked off. So it's blown out at the top there. That's exactly where it was blowing out. That bolt and that bolt weren't actually terribly tight. You can also see it's running a bit rich. There's a bit of, and it is running rich, I can guarantee that. There's a bit of carbon build up there. But overall, we'll double check it. But this is where I was talking about. You run silicon or RTV along there, and also on this end. Not that much that it oozes into the engine, but enough that it seals the gap. Let's have a look underneath the manifold and see what we can see there. I'll try and do this. Turn this up. Okay, that port there, that's not blanked off, it's actually used. That's interesting. But that's where it blew out, just there. So right there, that point there, that's where it had blown out. So that's interesting. This is used, but you can clearly see where that blew out. So if I peel this away, you can see the black there. That piece of gasket's blown out. That's very interesting. I'll have to get some advice of how I can prevent that from happening. But you can see the RTV here, on here, and it's important where the head bolts down. Look, where the head bolts down to the block in the corner, it's important to run it up a little bit past there, because they will leak otherwise. So that's curious about that. Okay, let's clean this up. Next day, got a few parts, done a few processes. So one of the things that I needed to do was to check that the profile of the bottom of the manifold here was the same as the profile of the valley in the motor. So I got a piece of wire and bent it to the exact shape of the valley in the motor. So I'll show you that. So you always keep your motor covered while you're not working as well, just to stop dust getting in there. So I got a piece of wire. You're not going to be able to see whether it fits well or not, but what I did was I bent it to the shape of the valley. So from here down the head to where the head meets the block, across and back up again. So this is perfectly shaped to that, and the idea is to get it absolutely spot on so that you can compare it. And what I'm comparing it to is the manifold, to see whether it all looks right. Because if the heads have been decked, or the block has been decked, so if either have been machined, then it changes the angle of the valley. So this looks good. Basically what it comes down to is I'm happy with it. Now I also have this. This is a profile gauge, so I can put that on there and I can see the exact same thing. So I put that onto the block and I basically pushed it down. So you push it to whatever shape, so you can put it under your face, your hand or whatever. So I put it onto the shape of the block and I got that shape that I showed you a moment ago. And it came up well. So I'm happy that I can start installing this. The other thing that I got, also I got the gasket set. So I'm not going to be using these rubber gaskets. I will be using these. Well, to be honest, I don't even know what the cork gasket's for, but I'm sure I'll work that out. And this is a new distributor gasket, so I'll be using that. And also got a nice new clutch fan. Nice new clutch fan. New clutch for my engine cooling fan. And that will replace this one here. Just a bolt-in operation, 4 bolts. Pretty easy to locate, pretty easy to find. It really goes by the size. I just measured from here, the offset, and that was it. Now what actually works is that when you're sitting in traffic, your fan, the clutch works and the fan spins, so that your engine cools. When you're actually driving along, once you're over, I don't know, 20 kilometers an hour or something like that, you really don't need a fan in most cases. Just the movement of the air through the radiator cools it down. So really this puts no drag on the engine when you're powering along, but just when you're sitting there idling, then the clutch works. Well, my clutch wasn't doing anything, so when it was idling it was just sitting there and this wasn't spinning around and it was overheating. So that'll be fixed as well. Convenient. Little update. I separated these, and what these actually are is cork versions of the gaskets to go in the valley. I'm not going to use them. I'm going to use RTV, but they're for there. So never used them before. Every man and their dog uses RTV. That's what I'm going to be using because it hasn't failed on me before. So you may have noticed how clean the bottom of the manifold was. I gave that a really good clean last night. I scraped it all off, and I just gave it a clean with some green Scotch-Brite as well, just to make sure that there was nothing there. Gave it a good clean, and I also got a straight edge and checked across the surfaces just to make sure that it wasn't warped, and it was really good. I'm all happy with it. Also gave the V of the engine block here a really good clean up. So if you haven't seen inside one of these before, what you've got, these are coolant galleries, so where coolant runs through the engine. This is intake for your, this is where the petrol and the air goes into each one of the cylinders, so there's 8 of those. And this here is the exhaust crossover. And I'm not sure, but it's either pollution gear. I think it might be to actually warm up the manifold for the auto choke, which is heat controlled choke. So it automatically turns off when the engine's warm enough. But it had blown out just across the top there, the previous gasket on this one over here. So I've given this a good clean up. It's been sitting there since last night, so I'm just going to give it another quick clean. So just using a bit of brake clean. Doesn't really matter whether it's brake clean or a bit of degreaser or something. I just want it to be clean. But brake clean is a universally good cleaner. Just giving it a wipe down. I tend to use paper towel for a lot of things, not for any technical reason. It's just I buy rolls of paper towel and I just have it hanging around, so anytime I want to dry my hands or clean a surface or whatever, I've just got it there and I don't have to worry about wasting a rag, which might seem a bit petty, but unless you've got an endless supply of rags available to you, they become a bit of a valuable commodity. Okay, it's pretty fine. Even though I've cleaned this a few times, you can see there's a bit of junk on there, so I want a nice mated surface for my gaskets. So I don't want to be doing this again soon. I've tried to keep as much rubbish out of the engine as I possibly can. A little bit of coolant does leak out of the galleries throughout the process, particularly when you take the manifold off. So I've made sure that was gone. Now I'm going to be running the bead of silicon across the valley. Yes, you can see that. So across here and across here. It's really important that the point where the head joins the block, that you continue up there just a little bit and up here just a little bit, and same on the back, because that point there is the point that it's most likely to leak from. What I'm going to do in a moment is just sit the gaskets in place, and without damaging them, I'm going to sit those in place, and I just want to see what sort of gap there is here, and that'll give me an idea of how much silicon or how much RTV to put there. Now these particular gaskets, they're good quality gaskets. They have this, I think it's like a silicon material around here. They're a metallic gasket, multi-layered, and they got like this silicon that goes towards the manifold and it creates a seal, so it just gives it a nicer seal. On the block side it doesn't have that. What I am going to do, when you try and set this in place, when you put the manifold on, it doesn't really want to stay in place, so it can drop down a little bit too far and it can be a bit hard to line up and it can get damaged and so on. So I'm just going to put a tiny little dot of RTV in a few spots on the back here, not for sealing purposes, just to glue it in place. Now the other one's already there, I've already done that, but I'll put some on here and I'll show you what I'm doing. Now again, it is just a tiny little dot, because all I want it to do is hold the manifold gasket in place, but I don't want to put a lump there that holds the gasket out from the mating surface. So I want this to squash down dead flat and really not be noticeable at all, but it will help to hold it in place. So I've got to get it lined up. Got to check that these gaskets are on the right way. These two gaskets are identical, left and right are the same, but you've got to make sure that you're not blocking anything off. Whenever you're putting any gasket on, put it on dry in the first place, check it out, make sure you know which way it goes, and then use it. Give it a tap to spread that out. Okay, I'm pretty happy with the position of that. Now I'm going to pop the manifold in place so I can see the gap below it in the front of the valley. Not installing it just yet, just popping it in place. Got to try and do it without dislodging those gaskets. And all I want to do is see the gap. Might use some feeler gauges to see. Now me personally, I actually don't care what the actual measurement is, I just want to know how much silicon to put in there. But I got some feeler gauges, and basically those three thicker gauges there, they went into that gap. Now I could add up what the calculation is on them. I just got a ruler and measured it. It's about 2 millimeters. It's about 2 millimeters across there. So what's that? I think that's about a 1/16 of an inch. So yeah, so that gives me an idea of how much silicon. Now that isn't torqued down, so it will pull down, the gaskets will flatten out a little bit, so it won't be that big a gap later on, but it gives me an idea of roughly how much silicon I want to put in there. That doesn't look extreme to me. No expert, doesn't look extreme to me. So I'm going to lift this back out, check that the gaskets are still in the right place, put some RTV, and then we'll pop the manifold on. Okay, so I've put a bead of silicon or RTV front and back, making sure I've got it in the corners. I just, with my thumb, just sort of smeared it on the inside lip just so that it doesn't peel away or anything, because I want a good seal there. I have checked on Google, because I don't know off the top of my head, the torque sequence, so the sequence to do the bolts up. So I've got that, and I've got an image of that. And the torque, the actual amount of tightness, the torque that I need to put on the bolts. So it says to run around, basically you start from the middle and work your way out in a particular sequence. But the first run around, putting 20 foot-pound of torque, and then run around a second time and put 30 foot-pound of torque. Now I'll actually be checking this a few times, because this is where I've had a failure before from the torque. So advice from a friend was to just pull it down very slowly. So I'm not even going to start off with 20 foot-pound. I'm going to start off just with a ratchet and just a small amount of pressure evenly, and then I'll torque it down from there. Okay, let's pop this thing in. I've got a couple of bolts on standby, ready to go on, and I've also cleaned the thread on those bolts. And the reason I cleaned the thread on the bolts was so that they all torque evenly. Now those holes look good. Don't really see much going on there. I think we're good. I'll just pop a couple of bolts in just anywhere. I'm not going to put any torque on them at all at the moment, just so it doesn't move. Play. What have we got? I think we've got to move across this way a little bit. Okay, so I just had to slide the manifold ever so carefully this way, because these bolts didn't want to go in the first place. So that's okay. Just finger tight, so no pressure on them. I'll grab some more bolts, pop them all in, and we'll start torquing them down. I've got all those bolts torqued down. So what I did was, what was it? I think it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and then the same again. So I went down and nipped them down by hand. You saw me doing that. Then I went through and nipped them down, and I did that about 3 times just by hand, just bringing it down little by little bit, working from the center, working out. Then I went into the torque sequence, and I did 20 foot-pound, and it's meant to be 2-stage, 20 foot-pound and then 30 foot-pound. I did a little slower, 20 foot-pound, then 25 foot-pound, and then 30 foot-pound. But again, working from the middle out, from the middle out in that torque sequence. Google it, it's easy to find. The issue I have is I can't access these with my torque wrench. So this is my torque wrench. So if you're not familiar with how a torque wrench works, you set down here, you can do it in kilograms or you can do it in foot-pound. So I've got this on 30 foot-pound at the moment, and how it works is that when you're torquing a bolt, you put it on there and it clicks. They're not all the same, but they work in the same principle. So if you listen carefully, when that clicks, that's telling me that it has reached 30 foot-pound. So all of the bolts that I've done there are at 30 foot-pound. So I've run around this several times because I want it to be right. So realistically, there's a torque for pretty much everything, but some things are crucially important, some less so. Your head bolts, for example, they have to be torqued down exactly, and there's a sequence, you will let it warm up and do it again, and so on and so forth. So I've gone through and done that. I couldn't get into here, so what I actually had to do, and this isn't desirable, but what I did was I practiced on a bolt for each torque for 20, 25 and then 30 foot-pound. I torqued it with my torque wrench, so it was just on the bench in the vise, torqued it so that I could feel it, and then I put the spanner onto it, because this spanner fits in there. I practiced with the spanner. Absolutely not ideal. If I could get a 3/8 drive torque wrench, because mine is a 1/2 inch drive, I could probably get in there, but I don't have one. So I'm pretty confident that I set some muscle memory within my arm as to how tight it needed to be, and that's what I've done through there. So if I was to check this one, the amount that it takes before it moves, I've tried to make it identical on all the others. It's not scientific, it's just what I've got, so we'll see if it works. These gaskets, I'll say, that I've used this time are much better than ones I used last time. These actually stick up about a 1/16 of an inch, or in metric, about 2 or 3 mil further than the port. So the other one didn't do that. And the other one was a fibre gasket, whereas this is a metal gasket. I'm pretty confident that that same issue won't happen again. Maybe another issue, but not that same issue. So we're going to start putting this together. A couple of things: don't let stuff fall down in your engine. They're just rags, just so if I drop a nut or a bolt, it doesn't go down in there. But I think I'm right to put this thing back together. Let's do it. Obviously I'm going to need to put a timing light on this once it's done, because I've had the distributor out. I haven't rotated the engine at all, so what I did before taking the distributor out, I actually marked where the rotor button was pointing, and I also marked roughly where the distributor was sitting within the engine, so that when I put this together, if I put it in the same place, then theoretically the timing should be very, very close to where it was before I pulled it out. Just so that I don't have to fiddle around with it too much once I get it going. Put it in there, hopefully it'll be close enough that this thing will start. So I'll show you those marks. So nothing flash, I just put a mark on the rotor button just so I could remember. There's other marks around here for other things, but just that blue mark there, you can see that. Realistically, once that rotor button is pointing there, then I know that I've got this distributor in pretty much the same place. And the vacuum advance was just sort of to the left hand of the rear runner for the intake. So I'll pop this in, should be in pretty close place. I'll put you on top. Just show you this. On the retainer that holds the distributor in, there's actually a slotted shaft. So if you just slide it back, bit of a shadow there. If you just slide it back, you can see you can move this backwards and forwards. So you don't have to take it out completely to put the distributor in, which took me a little while to learn that, because it's a bit hard to get it in afterwards. Now, because of the drive, this goes onto the cam, picks up the oil pump on the bottom. When you put it in, when you drop this in place, the rotor button rotates. So if you're trying to get it into a place that you knew where it was before, so I'm going to get this roughly around to where I think it needs to be. Now, my rotor button, I need it to rotate around to match that. So got to drop this in. Now watch what happens to the rotor button when it engages. It rotated around. let's get this clutch fitted. When I disassemble anything, I try and put all the nuts, bolts, screws, washers, whatever, back together where they come from. Like when I disassembled that engine, after I pulled it apart, or the manifold, after I pulled it apart, I actually put all the bolts and everything back in the same place that they came from. It makes it much easier to reassemble it if you're not looking for what goes where and all the rest of it. Okay, if you've done it enough times, you probably can remember somewhat. And I've done that enough times that I've got a pretty good idea of where things go, but it still makes it easier. You don't have to look. I dropped a washer on the ground, the way that I've got my throttle cable held in place, and we have to put a slotted washer there to keep it all in place. I dropped that on the ground and I couldn't find it, and then I had to make another one, but other than that we're all good. Oh, just look at this, this says front. I'm sure that was pointing the back, at the back. I'm almost positive that was pointing at the back. Why am I cleaning it? Because I can. Again, just a bit of brake cleaner. Crud in here, let's get it off. Ah, this also says Ford. How about that, eh? I didn't know that. I think this fan was on this motor when I got it. I don't really care. Some people might be deeply offended right at this point in time, but I have got a Ford fan on my Chev. What's that? 84DA. I think that's a, what is it, DA? I can't remember how the Ford codes work. C is the 60s, D is the 70s. Other than that, I can't remember how any of the rest of it works. So I'm probably still going to have this on backwards. Can't see how it'd make that much difference. Plate is pointing that way. That's pointing that way. Probably wouldn't throw quite the same amount. Interesting. I wonder. Oh, this is deeper. Okay, so this one is about 15 mil deeper. I think I have enough room anyway. I'm going to play around with this. I'll take you off camera. Okay, got that fitted up. Wasn't too much of a drama. So I can see that the holes on the back here had actually been slightly elongated previously to make it fit, but it all seems to fit well. It just sits out a little bit further. And as it turns out, the fan wasn't on back to front. I was just looking at it back to front because I'm an idiot. So let's see if it fits. I actually didn't check the diameter of this hole here. We'll soon find out. Okay, so I'm happy with that. Got the clutch fan sorted out, and I can actually feel it. It's doing something. Before I could just spin that, so I can spin it, but it's got resistance. I've put some coolant in it. It will drop down a little bit. I spilt some on the ground, so yeah, it'll drop down a bit. Going to start it up. I'm pretty sure I've done a double check 14 times. Pretty sure I'm right to go. Alternator belt's done up. Don't think I've got any problems. So I'm going to start it up, connected the battery up. Got to start it up. I'm going to try and start it. Let's first see if she'll start. Carby's empty, so it should take a minute, but otherwise, hopefully the timing's okay. Give it a little bit of choke. She needed a tune before I did this, so nothing's changed. Must have got the timing pretty close to where it was before. So I'm just going to let it warm up so I can check the coolant level. I'm actually just doing it through my filter there rather than a radiator cap because it's easier to get to. Okay, so I'll call that a success. Seems to run quite well. A bit of steam coming off it at the moment because I've just given it a hose down just to get coolant and stuff off, and I just degreased a bit of an area in the front where my power steering's leaking. But the fan just works really well. It's amazing how much difference that's made, and it doesn't seem to be leaking anything anywhere, so that's a good thing. Let's give it a start. Oh, I've played the key. Just bear with me for a second. Seems to be doing everything just well. Just nicely. So I'm going to call that a job. So that was intake manifolds on a 350 Chev, intake manifold gaskets on a 350 Chev. Showing you a couple of things there, things to be aware of, like that silicon in the valley, and using good quality gaskets, tensioning down or torquing down the bolts according to the pattern and evenly. Seeing that it's actually not hard to fit a Ford fan to a Chev clutch. That pushes my fan about 15 mil or half an inch, a bit over half an inch closer to the radiator, which is good. And when I rev it, it really pumps the air, so I don't think I'm going to have traffic light overheating issues anymore. So I'm happy with that. I'll take it for test drive tomorrow. I've bled the cooling system. This thing, because this top hose is high, it's not higher than the radiator, but it's very close. It takes me a little while to bleed the air out of this, so you've got to be sure to bleed the air out of your cooling system, otherwise you'll get an airlock and it doesn't cool properly, the thermostat doesn't open and it can overheat. So you do need to be careful of that. Some vehicles can be very hard to bleed. This one's sort of a little bit hard, but not terrible. So I'll take it for a test drive tomorrow. Hopefully it'll be okay. I normally run this at 80 degrees. That's where she seems to sit comfortably, and that's where she's sitting at the moment, probably about 79 degrees. I don't think I need that anymore. That was to remind me in case I jumped into it. Forgot to do that, so I had the filter lid loose to bleed some air out. Okay, thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed that. So the next day, and all is good. Took ToXiC for a test drive, and I'm happy to say all runs well, fans working well, no overheating issues, no coolant leaks, and the car's not sounding like a tractor. So I'm glad that that's all done. In the near future, we'll do some more things to ToXiC. We'll probably put that custom grill bar in and put the power steering pump in. So yeah, stay tuned. Not the power steering pump, the power steering box. So stay tuned for some more updates on ToXiC and some more updates on the other projects. Until then, I'll see you on the next one.